Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome, for a long overdue part 2, Taylor Johnson. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on again. Super excited. I remember being excited last time, but I'm excited to see to hear what's been going on since October 19, and zero has happened in the world between then and now. Just gone in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it's wild, right? Wild, yeah.
Crazy times. But anyone that didn't tune into the first episode, do you just want to give us a bit of an intro on yourself, what you're doing, what you did before, education-wise, all the good stuff?
Sure, yeah. So my background's in athletic performance, coached in college and the NFL for about 10 years. And 4 years ago, I made the pivot into gaming and esports. And it was one of those things that, I had known of it, but didn't realize how big it had gotten, and saw a huge opportunity in promoting health and wellness to millions of people worldwide. And who would have thought, do that through video games? So my career trajectory through that has been consulting and working for various teams and organizations. And now I work for Statespace Labs, which is a neuroscience gaming development company, where we're blending neuroscience, machine learning, AI, and video games to, surpass the limits of human potential. And that goes within gaming and across multiple other industries. And, even before all of that, I'll say that, my background in education was in exercise physiology and neurobiology, master's in exercise science with an emphasis in rehabilitation. So S&C and performance have always been kind of my squeeze, right? I've always told people that my passion is performance, and it's my curiosity that navigates me through the world. Which ultimately, that's how I got into gaming.
Nice, mate. So you were in San Francisco before?
49ers.
Okay, nice.
Yep.
So what kind of role was that? That was very much hands-on, gym-based?
It was, yeah. It was that and a bunch of other things too, right? So my bread and butter was the weight room, so classic S&C, but then also took on our sports science, did the nutrition, worked with our sports medicine staff on some rehabilitation, and really kind of worked with our team and joint teams between sports med and our S&C and overall performance on how do we optimize the best way that we can, knowing we're working backwards from game day. And it was a lot of fun, learned a ton, especially with the opportunity to wear all those different hats and have my hands in a bunch of different things. Had some amazing relationships and a lot of lessons learned.
So I know we went into this last time, but I think it's super, super interesting for people. How did the transition happen into the esports arena?
Yeah. Well, what kind of set it off was, being at the 49ers at the time, we just weren't a very good team. And I think a lot of people in traditional sports can relate to that, where, you get your wins and you get your losses. And ultimately what happens when you get enough losses, they do a coaching change. So I'd been there through one coaching change. And we had another season and we weren't doing too hot. And I was like, okay, we're probably going to go through another coaching change as well. Our staff had made it through one change. I didn't know if we were going to make it through another. And so I started to look, on the horizon and say, well, what else is out there? And I've always been entrepreneurial minded. I've always been really curious about where do these skill sets of performance and these strategies and tactics, where else does that fit? Because I've always had the understanding, the belief that we're all performers. We're all high performers. It doesn't matter in the context, right? It's the arena that we step into. So it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a soccer mom, or a stay-at-home dad, we all perform. And so I started to reach out to, friends and colleagues and mentors, and a good buddy of mine who is a CEO of a tech company up in Toronto, in Canada. He goes, you got to check out esports. And again, I had known of it, and I started digging in and being like, wow, this is amazing, and became really fascinated by the level of strategy and the tactics that go into it. And, for context, I'm not a gamer. Even to this day, I play, but I wouldn't call myself a gamer. I play so I can understand, what the gamers are actually going through on a day-to-day basis. So then I can think about, okay, but what are the demands that are placed on them, and how can we be more thoughtful around programming? So when I really got into the weeds, I realized that there are way more similarities than differences, which was kind of shocking. But then again, didn't surprise me once I really started to look at, okay, it's all the same stuff. Performance is performance, and there are groups of individuals that are, employed by organizations as professionals to train and compete at the highest level. And so that was kind of like this, this experience of being like, all right, let's go do this. And I think one of the moments that really kind of put me back on my heels, where I then dug in and charged straight ahead, is I was flying back from the East Coast. I was visiting a buddy out there, and I was standing in line at the TSA, checking in for my flight. And there was a woman and her young son in front of me, and they're going through the line and they check in. And the little kid was on this iPad. He was maybe, 7 years old, maybe a little bit younger. And he was playing on this iPad, Fortnite, I think. And, the TSA agent checks the mom in and looks down at the son. And he goes, hey, what's your name? The kid's not paying attention. He goes, hey, do you play any sports? As if like, hey, stop playing on your iPad. And the kid pauses the game, looks up at him. He goes, I don't play sports, I game. And I was like, whoa. It's not going anywhere, and it's only continued to grow. And with the professionalization of these teams that are now global, it's worldwide, the opportunity is there. And one of the big things that I think as performance coaches and just health and wellness professionals is we can take everything that we've learned in the context of traditional sports and other industries and really bridge the gap into this emerging sport and industry, and have a positive impact, and take all the lessons that we've learned, both good and bad, and not make the same mistakes, and really amplify what's possible in that space.
Nice. And again, I think I asked this before, but it'd be nice to get an insight into what's changed in the industry, what's developed in the industry, more definitely from a performance point of view, but just in general anyway, from like October 19, so 15, 16 months? I'm guessing things are moving pretty quick.
Very fast. The growth is exponential. One of the biggest things that really became apparent, and this was always an underlying current before, but when COVID really hit and everybody was locked down, I think people across, everybody felt it. Mental health became a really big issue and a really big topic of conversation. And that's always been something that's prevalent in gaming and esports. It tends to be quite toxic depending on the communities that you're involved in. And a lot more people started to speak openly about the struggles that they were going through. So one of the big changes that I saw is a shift in the conversation to really allow the space for that, and to also offer support and help. So that was one of the big things that started to happen. I think the other was people were realizing like we're way more sedentary than we've ever been before. We don't have the luxury, I will say, to actually go into an office and be around other people. A lot more people started to switch into, obviously working from home, but from the gaming community, it's nothing really changed for them other than like, hey, like now everybody else is like on our bandwagon. So I think the first conversation around mental health became a really big one, an even larger one. The second was, okay, well, people are way more sedentary. So then talking about nutrition and movement and recovery started to come into play. And a lot of the teams and organizations that were already kind of paving the way by hiring on performance staff, whether it's a sports psychologist, a nutritionist, either like a personal trainer or a physio, a lot more of those organizations started to jump on board because players, were burning out even more. And that's always been a pretty consistent theme. And that has to do with a lot of different factors. But I would say, the overall conversation around health and wellness has just been amplified. And now everybody's starting to view them, these esport players as high performers, as athletes, whatever you want to call them. In my opinion, you can call them an athlete or a gamer. It doesn't matter. They're a high performer. So then how do we give them the tools and resources to be the best and be successful?
Can you give us a bit of a high level view of when you say professionalism has moved on, like has increased? What kind of jobs are we talking about here? How many jobs are available? Like just a rough estimate of the industry. I know that's gonna be pretty.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Yeah, you had asked me that last time too. And
Sorry,
I kind of gave a wishy-washy. Yeah, I gave a wishy-washy answer, and it'll probably be more of the same. What I will say is the opportunity is, with the professional organizations that are really set up and have the proper funding. A lot of the jobs now are not necessarily in-house. Meaning like they have a specific person that's on staff where they're building out these programs. They're contracting. So whether they're contracting to a, performance company that's outside of it, or they're contracting with specific individuals. So they're bringing on sports psychologists or nutritionists or physios that either come on site or they're doing remote coaching, things like that. And that's happening, both in the UK, it's happening in the US, it's happening, pretty much everywhere. Teams are starting to say like, okay, this is an issue, especially because players are asking for it, which is, I think, phenomenal. Players are like, hey, other teams are doing this. Like, why don't we have this? I speak with a lot of other teams and players, and it's still a topic of conversation where they're like, hey, we realize that we're not sleeping well. We realize we're not eating well. We need to fix this. And so it's, identifying that problem and then going, filling that solution, which is, for all the performance coaches that are, either traditionally S&C or, if you want to call yourself, this holistic coach and look at performance, in terms of all the different variables that come into play. How can you best set yourself up to be noticed and to bridge that gap? What's
driving that? What's driving that need from the athletes, from the esports athletes? Where's that coming from? Just general influences from media and maybe wearables and data collected on themselves and realizing and being a bit more aware, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. I think it's a number of different factors, right? I think one is the players are starting to mature. So they're getting to, and when I say mature, we're still talking about fairly young individuals. They're anywhere from 18, 19 to mid 20s. What they're starting to realize is like, hey, my body is a machine. And just like I take care of my gaming rig and I do updates on my computer, I need to do that on myself as well. And I think also coupled with the feelings of burnout and fatigue, they're like, well, how do we fix this, right? And the players that have taken on that role and the leadership to start to eat well, get proper sleep, understand how exercise has incredible benefits cognitively and physically, other players on the team start to notice. And I think what helps amplify that message is streaming. So you have these individuals that, not only do they compete for an organization, but they have sponsorships and they stream on Twitch. So they talk openly about how they are taking care of their bodies and like what their routines look like. And a lot of them are talking about pre-game, post-game nutrition. They're talking about, different supplements that they're using. They're talking about how they're using mindfulness and meditation, which I think is fantastic. We need more of that. And I think it's kind of assumed that happens in traditional sports, like athletes just do that. But you wouldn't necessarily think that would be happening or come from an individual who plays video games. And so I think the more that happens and, the cat's out of the bag, like, hey, if you want to be a high performer, there are probably some foundational things that you need to do on a consistent basis. Key thing is consistency. You do these things well, you build these habits that turn into a lifestyle change, and that ultimately raises the bar and your aptitude for the level at which you can play and for how long. So the two things are performance and longevity.
One thing that I probably should have asked at the start, and it comes back to Statespace. Can you give us a bit more of an overview of what Statespace actually is and why you have such a good understanding of the whole industry, because it's so broad?
Sure. Yeah. So Statespace was, originally this brilliant idea by our CEO and our chief scientist. So our CEO is Wayne Mackey. Our chief scientist is David Heeger. And so Wayne is a lifelong gamer. He's been on a few other podcasts and shared his story, which is a phenomenal one. He was always thinking about like, what makes a great gamer? What are the things that really go into, from the cognitive standpoint, like how are they such high performers? And Wayne and David are neuroscientists from NYU. And so what they started to realize, what Wayne was looking at is like, well, if we take these same psychomotor tasks that are in the lab that are looking at speed, precision, accuracy, reaction time, we can essentially create a game that can capture all that data. And when we have all that data, it becomes very meaningful because then we can look at different aspects of each one of these, domains around perception, cognition, and motor skills. And, we can assess it. We can create diagnostics around that, and then we can train it. And so that's kind of what started the whole impetus of Statespace, which is now turned into this entire platform with over 8 million users now, which is wild, to be a part of such an amazing organization that has that much reach and impact. And we're out there to solve problems. I mean, that's the big thing. For us, it's not just about gaming. It's about how do we solve these human potential problems and take what we're learning across multiple different industries and have a positive impact.
Strong mission. Super strong mission.
Yeah. And, and to your point too, it's, we're very fortunate to have a lot of people that play our game. We have partnerships with amazing teams and organizations and players that, really vouch for what we're able to give them in terms of, different tools. We just launched Creator Studio, which is essentially, for all the coaches out there, it's essentially like your ability to create practice scripts and ability to create context around training scenarios. And the cool thing about this is like players that use our game can actually do that themselves. So they can come up and recreate maps that mimic in-game scenarios. And then with that, they can come up with different target practice within those different scenarios. So imagine like small-sided games and things like this. And, we could do that on our own, which we have. However, when you give the power to the people, you just get this exponential growth in the ability to train in multiple different scenarios and sharing. And there's a whole social aspect to it as well.
So they're going in within a game, picking out certain scenarios and training them specific areas that they need to be trained?
Sure. So imagine, like one of the big games is Valorant, right? It's a first-person shooter, team-based game. So there are certain maps in Valorant that you're able to play. And so what our users can do now is they can go in and recreate those maps and then play through those maps and have specific training scenarios or target practice around, like if I want to peek around a corner, or if I want to focus on headshots, or if I want to practice my timing, and all these different components that you can kind of build in as layers to how they go and practice, and then they can jump in real game and go play and see like that transfer. And this kind of gets to, I think we talked about this on the last podcast, and I've talked about this with other people as well. The concepts around training. I always think about like Andrew Tony Bonachuk with, the transfer of training, right? Where you have competitive exercise, specialized preparatory, specialized developmental, and GPP. It's the same, right? And just swap out exercise for task, right? So we have the competitive task, which is the game itself. We have specialized preparatory tasks, which are something that is a derivative of that, and you just work backwards. So it's really fun to see are the users and players like start to create these scenarios, and I'm kind of seeing it unfold where it's like, okay, those are specialized tasks or those developmental tasks. So it's really fun to see that. And I think that's going to drastically change the industry, because kind of going back to the earlier point about burnout, one of the big things that I would say is an issue is players don't know how to practice. And there are some teams that are doing a better job of this, but really players think that you just have to grind the game, and they'll play 8 to 12, maybe more hours, back to back playing these games. And there is a point of diminishing returns. And so it's really finding, throughout that gaming experience or that session length, like where is that point, where's that drop off? And like, when do you need to have a break and how much is too much? And this kind of gets into the concept of like cognitive load. And understanding cognitive load theory, and with working memory and our capacity to be able to take in so much information and process at any given time. And at what point is it enough where you need to like take a break? And we always laugh and encourage like go sleep, so you can actually like learn what you just like put yourself through. Because the learning doesn't happen in the moment. The learning happens after, when you actually sleep and crystallize all that. So there's so much more opportunity in the space. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about it.
Does the mental side drive the performance departments a lot of the time with these teams? So the psychological, the cognitive, the neuroscience, does that drive it, rather than like in a traditional sport, you may have, it's normally the S&C coach or the sports scientist who gets that kind of head role. In esports, is it driven by the psychologist and the mental skills team?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of it's kind of across the board. I mean, all the major teams have a whole department of data analysts. So they're breaking down game film. They're looking at specific strategies and tactics and the ratio, the win to loss ratios, and all these different metrics. So data is a really big thing in gaming. It's not like in traditional sports where, you're lucky if you get a guy to wear a GPS unit or RFID, because they don't want Big Brother watching them. And, what are you going to use this data for? That was definitely something we ran into a lot.
Yeah.
With gaming, like everything is collected, and they're incredibly numbers driven. So I think the first thing starts with them knowing that the data is actually really beneficial to them. And then it's the drive from the players to want to learn more about their own skills and how they rank against other players. And then also you have, the sports psychologists and other team managers getting real curious about, okay, well, here's where we're at. How much potential do we actually have? Like, what is the lift that we can get if we start to look at some of these other domains around the neuroscience and start to unpack that? And more research is coming out, which is more exciting. There are way more initiatives now than there have ever been. And I imagine even more so, in the next 3 to 6 months. And it's continuing just to steamroll in that sense. And I think as more of that information gets out, more people are going to be even more curious and interested around, okay, well, how do we use this data? Like, how can we make this actionable and meaningful, right? Because we all know if you collect information, if there's no context behind the information, it's worthless. Like, you can't do anything with it. And again, that's one of the exciting things about gaming and esports is that you get all this information that's very specific in the context of what the competition task or exercise is, which is playing this game. So it maps over very beautifully.
So when you say about the specific preparatory period, that's pretty obvious when it comes to esports. When it comes to the general stuff, what does that look like in your head when you think of like Bondarchuk?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's the fundamentals, for them. So it kind of comes down to like these 5 buckets, at least what I call these 5 buckets for gaming. So you have game knowledge, game sense, mechanical skill, teamwork and communication, and tactical decision making. And so when I think of the fundamentals, it would be, okay, so from the game knowledge, like, are you up to date on all the patches for the game? Do you understand the meta? The meta is basically, the entirety of like how the game operates, which changes in esports. It's not like in football or American football, like the game doesn't change. Yeah. When developers release a new patch and they release a new meta, they introduce new heroes or characters. It changes the entire meta of how you play. And that kind of adds to the overall cognitive load and stress because now players have to go relearn, or not even relearn, they have to learn new ways on how to play the game with these new characters. So it changes very much. So the game sense is, okay, the repetition, right? It's that intuition of when you're playing. Like, it blows me away watching these individuals play because it's like they have this crazy sixth sense of just knowing where people are going to be on the map, given the information they're seeing from their mini map, the communications that are coming in from their teammates. I mean, it blows me away every time. Mechanical skill is, essentially, if it's a first person shooter, it's going to be the target practice. How are you with your flicking and swiping and smoothing? These are all, maneuvers that they do with the mouse to actually hit the target that they're going for. And then teamwork and communication is refining the overall communication in game and out of game. And so for them, it's, in game, it's the same kind of calls or plays that you would have that a quarterback's making in American football. They have codes and colors and, there's checks and balances for everything that's going on. And then out of game too, it's, well, how do you debrief? Like, how are we working on our team communication and how are we doing after action reviews and being able to break down information? And then for the last one is the tactical decision making is, okay, well, how are we actually setting up plays? So at the fundamental level, I think like that's kind of like GPP stuff. Like, hey, how are we doing these things on a general basis, both individually and collectively? And then even underneath that is, what are we doing around, looking at our lifestyle, our nutrition, our movement, our recovery, our mental strategies to just deal with stress and pressure and coping mechanisms. Like, that to me is, I would say, even like the core of it all. How are we being a human being? Like, what are the things we're doing to really amplify ourselves so that we can show up every single day and perform at our best? And if we're not, if I show up at 50% and say, Rob, I'm 50%, man, I need you to carry me today. Or like, I may need some backup. And like, having that open and honest communication is key. And a lot more players are really keen into that and realizing the value because it builds trust.
What's the general thoughts around this kind of lifestyle, general health, nutrition, sleep? I know you've mentioned it a couple of times, but I guess that's where the head of a normal strength and conditioning coach will go. Okay, where do I fit? Like, I want to be hands-on with this guy. I want to be in a gym environment or an environment like that to work with these players. What's their feeling around that and then been put in them environments with those type of traditional S&C coaches like you were?
Yeah. I mean, it's all a conversation, you know, like that's the beautiful part. I mean, the more I think that we show up without an ego and, you know, really meet the people where they're at and understand what are the pain points for them, because everybody's different, you know, and everybody's education level is different in terms of like their understanding of the knowledge and the resources that are presented to them. And I may have shared this before on the previous podcast, but when I was interviewing my players and I was asking them like, hey, what's been the big obstacle or obstacles that have really kept you from pursuing more of a healthy lifestyle? It kind of came down to three things. It was a lack of knowledge, a lack of resources, and a lack of confidence. And, you know, the lack of knowledge is interesting because there's so much knowledge out there, and therein lies the rub, because there's so much, they have no idea what's the right knowledge to follow and like what works best for me and like what diet should I do or what's this new supplement I should take. You know, so that was the big knowledge gap. And then also, how do I do that? Like, here's what it is, but how do I do that? And do I really understand the why behind it? The second part with the resources is, you know, they may not have the financial means to do so, you know, and this is if you're in like tier 3, tier 2 teams, or you're aspiring pro, or even just a casual player. They may not have the resources to have a nutritionist or to have a personal trainer or access to a physio or things like this. So there's those two things. And I found if you can do those, you can give them, what comes with that is confidence. And the confidence was a big thing. I was like, okay, well, I may have the first two, but like, I don't want to go into a gym, you know, because I've never worked out before. And I don't want to be that guy that people look at and like, what the hell is that guy doing? You know, so there's that. And there's also the confidence to be able to speak up and voice what's really going on for them. And so I think if, you know, you're a traditional S&C coach, I mean, obviously your mind may go to like, hey, sleep and nutrition, recovery, like, yes, but I would pause and say, you know, first really understand what's going on for them on a personal level and check in with yourself and be like, okay, am I bringing any of my own biases to this? And then try to remove that as much as possible and meet them where they're at and really understand at their level, what are they going through? What are the opportunities? What are the problems? And then how do you create solutions around that? And everybody's different.
So, and again, I think we covered this in the last episode, but I'm really interested to get another kind of your thoughts 15, 18 months on. So for coaches wanting to pivot into this area, what would be your advice? Like, it sounds really good, and the opportunity, and I speak about it, and we've spoken about it on Twitter and on social and things, about the unbelievable opportunity that I still don't think a lot of people are really grasping. For anyone that's interested, what would be your advice to make that transition, or at least get in a headspace so they can make a little bit of a transition over into esports, or even have a little dabble in that area? What would be the recommendations for you?
Yeah, great question. You know, I think it goes back to, again, removing the bias, you know, of view them as performers, high performers, you know, because if you go in there, they'll be like, oh, well, these are gamers, you know, like it's not going to be fun. I don't know if I could get into that. You know, you got to remove that initially because you'll never actually see the full opportunity and potential. You know, because gaming and esports is really the tip of the spear for what I think is going to be the next wave of performance, which is cognitive performance, and leaning into that to explore what's possible in that space, which then opens you up to way more opportunities than traditional sports could have ever offered you. I mean, we're talking about dealing with multiple different industries and high performers across the world. I mean, and that I think is the most exciting part of this. So if you want to start with esports, I would say first just gain a basic understanding of what the ecosystem looks like, especially in your area. You know, reach out and see if there's any colleges or teams, you know, whether it's aspiring pro or like tier 3, tier 2, tier 1 teams. That's kind of like how they move up in rank. You just kind of get a basic understanding of that, and then really think about, be honest with yourself of what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses. Like, are you a nutrition guy? Like you may, you know, for me, myself, like S&C, you know, classically, like the weight room is my bread and butter, but I don't really consider myself a weight room guy. Like I loved it and I still train and I love that. And when the time is right, I do introduce that. But for me, I'm more around the relationships and the holistic approach to like, how does all this fit together? And like, how do you create these programs and periodize training so that you can do what you want to do and love that you do consistently? So I think being really clear on that with yourselves, excuse me, and really identifying the ways in which you can add value and thinking strategically on, okay, if I were to approach these teams and these players, like what is my MVP? Like what are the ways which I can show up and add value? And sometimes that's going to be for free, and just trying to get your foot in the door and learning, like have that be market research and start to work with a handful of players here and there and just get a sense of what that's like, the struggles, the conversations. A big part of when I left the NFL and started consulting is I did a lot of that work for free because one, I knew nothing and I knew there was a lot to learn. And two, I wanted to add as much value as I could because I knew that if I did that, it would turn into something down the road. Like I just believed in that. And I've always been people first. And I think one of the biggest things I would offer is, me, myself, I've always been more interested in the people playing the game than the game itself. And, people say, hey, do you love football? You were in football, American football for so long. I'm like, no, actually I don't. It's kind of funny. Like I don't really watch the NFL anymore. As soon as I left, I cared more about the people playing the game than the actual game itself. I understood what was going on in the game. And I think that can kind of alleviate some of the stress and pressure around those that wanted to get into esports because they're like, oh, do I have to be a gamer to actually get in and add value and provide a benefit? And my answer would be no. The value that you bring is actually really unique because it's a different perspective. You're able to look at it from an outsider's lens and say, hey, here are the things that you're doing. We're not saying you have to change everything all at once, but here are some ways in which you could amplify this area or this area. And I think that's an incredible benefit. It's just, again, how do you curate that conversation and create that relationship with the organizations and the players that you're working with so that you can have that foundation to really work from?
Is there any hubs of teams across the globe that are in existence? Like you're in Austin. Is Austin a big hub for esports?
There's a lot of streamers that live in Austin.
Okay.
That's for sure. Yeah, a lot of streamers live in Austin. The thing about gaming is like it's all over the world. So big hubs. there's the franchise slots, North America that are in LA. So a lot of teams are based in LA. There's a few, I don't know if there's I would say hubs, but over in the UK, there's some big ones. I know Spain has some teams. Over in Asia, there's tons of teams over in Asia. So it's hard to say like one specific location. The one that comes to mind for me is LA in the United States, just because of the 2 franchise spots and there's gaming developments, companies down there as well. So I would actually look around and see who are the gaming developers, like where are they at? Where are these professional teams or the organization of teams, like where are they based out of? And start to just work backwards from that.
And these guys are clearly young high performers. What kind of age range are we typically dealing with here? Is it like when you pass kind of 21, you're almost a 35-year-old in football?
Yeah, it's guys and girls, right? It's not just guys
that
are playing professionally. And, I think, it's funny because people get to their mid-20s are like, he's an old-timer. I'm 34 and I'm like, man, what?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of that, the age range is really going to be from, even like adolescents that are, starting to play at such a very young age, and going into young adulthood. And, we're looking at around probably average age is around mid-20s, and then it kind of brings up the question around burnout and why are players dropping off and burning out in their mid-20s. And it's probably due to a lot of different factors, lifestyle factors, as well as the training routine and the grind of the game itself and how practice is set up. You have some players that are, late 20s, early 30s. Those are very far and few between. So it's very interesting. I think that's one of the biggest values we can really bring to the industry is, well, how do we raise that ceiling? There's no reason why these players should be dropping off like that. And then a whole other topic is, well, what happens to them? Are we actually doing the things that we need to do to give them the tools, the resources, and the mentorship so that they can go be successful, in life after gaming? Because at the end of the day, we're dealing with people. We're dealing with young individuals that are dedicating the first part of their lives to being the best at their craft. And then what? So that's a whole other topic that I'm really passionate about as well. It's like, how do we affording these individuals an opportunity to go be successful for their lives after gaming? And that's a big area that's out there too. And a lot of organizations are starting to think about that. They're either allowing for, ongoing education or providing scholarships or stuff like this, which I think is great. Here in the States, there's a really growing collegiate scene.
Okay.
So you have like full-blown scholarships for esports now. The universities that don't have big sports programs like American football or whatever it may be, they have scholarships as a recruiting tool for really smart individuals to come play at their college, which is brilliant. You got individuals that, their medium of performing is this, machine human interface, and they're the best in the world at it. So then it kind of poses like, well, what can we learn from them in that regard? Like, they know computers better than pretty much anybody out there because they're working on these computers all the time. So I think that's really cool too.
I'm thinking, like, as these gamers get older, like dexterity drops. Is there any common injuries that these guys pick up along the way that would mean that like mid-20s is kind of the bit, like in the football terms, beat up?
Yep.
Yeah.
So, it's a lot of overuse injuries. It's primarily overuse injuries in their hand, wrist, elbow, shoulder. They tend to get a lot of neck, shoulder pain, headaches, eye strain, low back pain. And a lot of that stuff, all of that is preventable in my opinion. It's just about how do you put together like a prehab workout routine, and how do you have just general maintenance? And then what are you doing after when you're done playing to actually unwind and reset? Obviously you're sitting down for long periods of time. So you get this reciprocal inhibition, your hips get super tight and gum down. So obviously your glutes are going to shut off. So your hamstrings and low back take over, and then they start to get this back pain. And some players have the most outrageous postures when they're playing. You're like, what are you doing? But they're so good. So you're like, okay, well, I don't want to like tweak it too much. It's like the guy who kind of runs weird. Like, yeah, but he runs so fast. Like, you don't want to tweak too much on him. So there's definitely that. And I think that kind of also goes into the whole stigma around gaming. It's like, well, they're just playing video games. Like, yes, and they're playing at a very high level with extreme cognitive output. They're burning a tremendous amount of calories. Their physiological metrics, their heart rates are through the roof. They're, 160, 180 beats per minute. They're getting up there. Cortisol is through the roof. They're getting all the same physiological markers that you would see in other sports. Why don't we treat them like athletes?
Interesting. Do you know of any, I'm sure there's loads of stuff going on and probably stuff coming out that I'm just not aware of, but research, is there any particular areas of research that are really interesting right now?
Yeah, there's a lot. A lot of it's really starting to look at, like what type of wearables can be used in the gaming context. Load management tools like that, AMS, like athlete monitoring systems. And how do we start to collect all this data and really say, okay, like how do we provide this information back to them to really optimize? I think a lot more people are starting to look into the physiological stuff, so, hey, what are like the system of systems in terms of our physiology that's going on, pre-practice, during practice, post-practice, things like this. A lot of it's going to be around computer science and neuroscience and really trying to understand that machine-human interface and what's really happening. I, for one, am incredibly fascinated with cognitive load and thinking of it through the lens of, okay, well, we think about periodization in traditional S&C on like working backwards from game day. We've got these variables, volume, density, intensity, and frequency. We're really good at being able to manipulate those variables to elicit the result that we want and have them perform their best when it matters most. Why aren't we doing that with our cognitive side? Like, why aren't we looking at perception, cognition, and motor skills and looking at our cognitive load and working memory and deficits and drop off in performance at specific times and being more strategic around how do we create more methodical and thoughtful programming so that you can do that consistently and for longer?
Is that happening? Are we in the midst of that now in esports? Is that starting to come in?
Yeah, it's starting to happen, which is cool. And then a lot of people are looking at nutrition supplements as well as it relates specific to gaming tasks and things like this. So the same sort of, surge in sports science that happened in traditional sports is starting to happen in esports. And it's, again, kind of looking at, okay, well, what are the things that matter most? do we even know all the things that matter most? And starting to unpack and ask those questions and solve for that.
So is there any specific tools that teams are using to try to measure this cognitive load for the performance?
So there's a few. I mean, a lot of people are just trying to understand first, like with the revisions of cognitive load theory and like what really pertains to things now, and especially around like working memory. I mean, one of the beautiful things about AIM-Lab and what we're doing is we're able to look at these 3 different buckets around perception, cognition, and motor skills and say, okay, like what's happening within a given 60-second session, and then from that, what information can we extrapolate out and start to look at other areas on how we can optimize that training. A lot more AI is being incorporated to it as well. I mean, not only for our platform, but just in general, people are getting really, really slick with how they're using AI and, kind of creating these maps for performance based off, initial data that they're collecting. So I would imagine a lot more of that's going to be coming out in the future as well. And I would like to see that too. And one of the things that I love is having conversations with other colleagues and people across multiple industries and just, knowledge share and just talking shop. And just be like, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm thinking about. Like, what do you think? Like, I had an amazing conversation yesterday with Pete McKnight, who's the director of performance. Yeah. So he listened to our podcast that we did and he hit me up and he's awesome. What's up, Pete? And we had a great conversation, talking about Formula One drivers and how Hinsa's looking at, providing the same tools for esport players and really thinking about, the neurological side of it. Like what's under the hood? And so I think as more people get interested and look beyond just the physical output and really start to think more deeply on the cognitive output and what needs to be true to enhance these things, then it gets really exciting.
Yeah, I'm delighted you've mentioned Pete, by the way, because I think me and him spoke about it when I'd done the episode. We'd done the episode together. So that's great that he's reached out and you've had a good chat. But that leads me on nicely because my next question was going to be, have you spoke to anyone that has made that transition away from traditional sports and into esports just like you did? That's kind of a bit of another like success story. And obviously Pete's thinking about that with his Hinsa hat on. But is there anyone else?
Sure. I mean, there's a few people that are getting their feet wet and either coming out. It's actually really cool to see. I mean, young people that are coming out of college or going into college and they're like, hey, I'm interested in the science and physiology and the neuroscience, but I'm not interested in traditional sports. I'm interested in gaming, which I think is awesome. So there's a lot. I think there's going to be a whole generation of performance coaches with this, niche around esports that are going to be coming up through the ranks, which is awesome to see.
That's great.
In terms of people crossing over from traditional sports, I think there's a few. And I wouldn't even say like mine's a success story, right? I'm still learning. I'm still going. I'm figuring it out. And that's the beauty of it too. I think there is still some hesitation. Like people don't really get the opportunity. They don't really see it as a viable means, for a profession. They may think it's like something fun to kind of like just dabble with. But it's very real. And, what I always go back to is, S&C is always going to be there and you can always go back to it. So, and I get that once you leave an organization, it may be tough to get back in with that organization, but you always have that on your resume. And, it's one of those things where, when I left the NFL, everyone told me it was career suicide. And I was like, okay, yeah, we'll see. And that was part of like the fun in it too, being like, okay, no, I got this. I could figure this out. And I'm still figuring it out. And, the role that I'm doing now with Statespace is more on the product side too. It's learning about, how to be a product manager and how to think through the lens of the end user, which is so, I mean, when I really I made this shift and this click of being like, oh, this is just performance coaching. We have this goal in mind. We're trying to optimize for these things. How do we work backwards from that? How do we work with a team of individuals, with engineers and our design and everybody else that's involved in the process of creating this feature or this product? And then how do we release that? That's like our, winning a game or like, winning a big match or a tournament is like, hey, let's release this product. And then how we get the feedback from our users. And so I really love that now. And I think there's so much of that opens up this opportunity to use the skill sets of a traditional S&C coach across multiple different industries. You just have to think a little bit differently and put yourself out there and take some risks. And I've had a few colleagues that, I've spoken to, and they're completely burnt out from traditional sports and working within it's a grind. And I know you've talked about this a lot too. It's a grind. And there's only a few jobs. I mean, there's many jobs, but there's really a few positions that, really super fulfilling, at least in my opinion. And people are getting burnt out, so, and the work-life balance, like that's a huge thing too. My whole life was dictated by the schedule of a team in which I had no control over. And now, don't get me wrong, it's still a grind, but I have more, agency over my life, given that I work for a startup and outside of the whole grind of traditional sports.
So for a performance coach in an esports setting, is the schedule pretty fixed? Is it like a season in like an NFL season or EPL season? What would that look like for a performance coach generally? We don't obviously know specifics, but generally.
So I'll just take like North America, with the 2 franchise spots that they have. So they have Overwatch League and the LCS, which is League of Legends Championship Series, and they have seasons. So it's, they have their different splits. And so for a performance coach, they're going to be working with the teams pretty much year round in that sense. Maybe they'll have some off time and they'll have like the periods where they're on and they're playing their games, or they'll have their downtime. They have off season, things like this. So it's very similar. Again, there's way more similarities than differences. And depending on the organization and how you're employed, whether it's a contractor or, you're actually embedded within the organization, your schedules will vary. But a lot of the performance coaches that I know that are working with organizations, like a lot of them are PTs, actually, physios.
Okay.
And so they have their own practice, and then they also work with the teams, or they work with a few teams and then a few players on the side. And so they're still able to, do other things as well. And then there's the few that I think, have like full blown, that's all they do. That's what I did when I was at Infinite, and I was their VP of performance, where that's all I did was think about the performance programs and how do we build out these models for, at the time we had 5 professional organizations, 14 teams and a developmental academy. So it was like, how do we really work and build out those structures and systems so that these teams could be successful?
So for a structure like that, how many performance coaches were working under or with you?
Yeah, so I had myself, I had my right-hand guy, Trevor Love. He was actually, he'd be another, what you call a success story too. Yeah. I pulled him from traditional sports. He was my big sounding board when I was throwing around these ideas and being like, hey man, I think I'm going to go for this. And he was like, do it, coach, just do it. And so I swooped him up. And so it was myself and Trevor, and then we had a whole fleet of interns that were helping us. And, every one of those guys and gals that were part of that process of building that, incredibly grateful for, and it takes a team effort, really. So what we had, I think, was very special. Not a lot of organizations, I don't know if any organizations had a system or a team in place like we did, and with the magnitude of the number of teams that we were working with. I would love to see that happen more frequently, because it just adds so much value to the players.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up to half past the hour, which I said I'd only keep you until. But it's been super fascinating. We could go on for ages and just go one question after another as it comes into my mind, because there's so many questions that I think people would want answering. But like Pete, reaching out, what would be the best? Where's the best place for people to reach out should they have any questions about esports in general, your work at Statespace, transitioning from traditional sports, whatever it may be?
Totally. Yeah, you can reach out to me on Twitter. It's Coach T_Johnson. That'd probably be the best place. LinkedIn, I think LinkedIn's a good spot too. You could look me up on LinkedIn. Just, bear with me. Sometimes like LinkedIn gets a bit, just inbox full, but if you send me a message or, I always try to get back to people as fast as I can. So LinkedIn, Twitter, you could shoot me an email at taylor@statespacelabs.com. Totally. My whole thing on this too is, I don't have all the answers, and I'm working to figure it out. And one of the biggest benefits in all of this is knowledge sharing and, really helping people that really want to make that transition. I'm very passionate about that, of, us being able to be in a position to, to really live into our purpose and to share information and, help people be the best they can be. So if you have any questions, comments, even concerns, or you don't didn't like anything that I said, like, let me know. Like, I'm totally open to have a conversation and kick ideas around, because then I learn and grow, and that's a win-win.
Of course. So do you have, I mean, you said that the inbox is often full on LinkedIn, but there's plenty of people, there's lots of interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fun to see. I mean, a lot of people reach out and they hit me up and ask questions, and, you know, whether they're trying to get into the space or they're already in the space working with a few players and have questions or comments. And, yeah, I mean, it's fun to see, and it's definitely increased over the years. I mean, 4 years ago, like, nobody was really asking about it. And now, you know, people are just kind of hitting me up, and it's phenomenal, you know, so please reach out and, you know, or just ping me on Twitter, and I'll circle up and I'll get back to you.
Awesome. Taylor, super, super interesting. And I think this will go down very well, because there's a lot of interest in this area. As we keep, every now and again, it'll come up on Twitter and I'll tag you in, because interested in your take on things. So yeah, super interesting. I think there'll be lots of value. So thank you very much. Stick around. We'll have a little chat, but really appreciate it. Thanks, mate.
Yeah. Thanks you, man. I really appreciate the work that you do, and, you know, really acknowledge you for putting information out there and bringing great people on. And I learned so much from your podcast as well. So I appreciate the work that you're doing.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. See you, mate.
Cheers. Bye.